The sky above Aluum 3 was burning. Commander Pellin stood on the outer wall of the colony's only fortified outpost and watched the orange glow spread across the horizon. 3 days ago, this moon had been quiet. Green jungles, soft winds, a small colony of 12,000 Tesari civilians going about their simple lives. Now the jungle was on fire, and the ground shook every few minutes as another Vethkai dropship slammed into the dirt somewhere beyond the tree line. Pellin gripped the railing with his long, thin fingers. His species was not built for war. The Tesari were tall, fragile creatures with delicate exoskeletons and wide, dark eyes designed for reading star charts, not watching armies approach. His garrison had 200 soldiers. They carried light pulse weapons meant for scaring wildlife and breaking up small disputes. They had never fought a real battle. The Vethkai had 10,000 warriors on the ground already, and more were coming. He turned to the young liaison officer standing behind him. Ovali was trembling. His wings, thin and decorative like all Tesari wings, were folded tight against his back, the way they always were when he was afraid. "Send the signal," Pellin said. "Priority 1. Send it to everyone." Ovali rushed to the communication room and transmitted a distress beacon on every galactic cooperative frequency. The message was simple. Colony under attack. Vethkai invasion force. Requesting immediate military support. Please hurry. Then they waited. The first response came from the Cooperative Regional Command. Pellin read it and felt his stomach drop. All nearby fleets were already deployed to other conflicts. No member species could redirect ships to Aluum 3 in less than 30 days. They recommended evacuation, but the Vethkai blockade fleet in orbit made that impossible. The colony was trapped. Pellin sat down heavily. 30 days. They would not last 30 hours. Then, a second message arrived. Ovali brought it to him on a datapad, his hands shaking so badly that the screen rattled. The message had come from a species that had only joined the cooperative 2 standard years ago, a species that most members had barely heard of. The transmission was short, with no formal diplomatic language, no official codes, no fleet designation beyond a single word. It read, "Received your signal. 1 squad inbound. Hold what you can. Ironclad actual." Pellin stared at the message for a long time. Then he looked up at Ovali. "1 squad," he said. "We are being overrun by 10,000 Vethkai soldiers, and someone is sending us 1 squad." "Sir," Ovali said carefully, "the species is listed under an unusual classification in the cooperative registry. I looked them up." "And?" Ovali pulled up the file on his datapad. His dark eyes moved across the screen, and as he read, his trembling got worse. "The species is called humans," he said. "Homeworld designation, Earth. It is a rocky planet with a gravity of 1.0 standard." Pellin blinked. Tessari's standard gravity was 0.6. 1.0 was almost double. "Their atmosphere is an oxygen-nitrogen mix," Ovali continued. "It is corrosive to most cooperative species on prolonged exposure. The planet's surface is 70% covered in a liquid solvent they call water. Their world contains active volcanoes, regular seismic events, extreme temperature ranges from -89 to 57 degrees, and a native biosphere where nearly every life form is either a predator, a parasite, or both." The room had gone very quiet. Several Tesari officers had gathered to listen. Ovali swallowed hard and read the final line of the file. "Planetary classification, Deathworld, Category 12. Nobody spoke. Category 12 was the highest rating the cooperative assigned. It meant that the world in question was considered actively hostile to intelligent life. Most Category 12 worlds had no civilizations on them at all. The conditions simply didn't allow it. Earth had produced a spacefaring species anyway. "1 squad," Pellin said again, but this time the words sounded different. Hours passed. The Vethkai launched another probing attack on the northern wall. Pelun's soldiers held them off, barely, losing 11 fighters in the process. The colony's shields were failing. Power generators were running on backup. The civilian shelters were full, and the sound of children crying drifted up through the vents. Then the orbital sensors screamed. Something was coming through the Vethkai blockade. The blockade was 5 heavy cruisers and a carrier. Enough firepower to glass the entire moon. Nothing should have been able to get past them. A single ship punched through the formation at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for its size. It was small, barely larger than a shuttle. The Vethkai ships fired on it. They hit it. The ship took the hits and kept coming. It was trailing fire and smoke, and pieces of its hull were peeling away. And it did not slow down. It dove straight for the colony, like a rock thrown by an angry god. The ship hit the landing zone so hard that the ground cracked beneath it. Dust and debris blew outward in a ring. Pelin watched from the wall as the smoke cleared. The ship was damaged, scorched black, leaking fluid from a dozen wounds. By any reasonable standard, it should not have survived the landing. The cargo ramp dropped with a heavy clang. 6 figures walked out. They were shorter than Tessari, broader. They moved with a strange heaviness that came from growing up under a gravity that would have crushed Tessari bones. They wore thick plates of dark armor that covered them head to toe, scarred and dented from old battles. They carried weapons that Pelin's military database could not immediately identify. The weapons were large. They looked heavy. The humans carried them like they weighed nothing. The one in front stopped at the base of the ramp and looked up at the burning sky. Pelun could not see the human's face behind the helmet. But something about the way the creature stood there, completely still while the world burned around it, made every instinct in Pelun's body scream at him to run. The human reached up and removed his helmet. Underneath was a face with brown skin, dark eyes, and short black hair pressed flat with sweat. There was a long scar running from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. He looked up at the Tessari soldiers staring down from the wall, and he didn't smile, and he didn't frown. His expression was calm and steady, the way deep water is steady. "I am Captain Tejo," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "Ironclad Squad, Terran Rapid Response. We received your signal." Pelin climbed down from the wall to meet them. Up close, the humans were even more unsettling. He could feel heat coming off their bodies. Their eyes moved constantly, tracking everything around them, the walls, the rooftops, the tree line, the sky. They breathed the air of Aluum 3 without masks, without filters, as if the atmosphere of an alien moon was just air to them. Pelin said, "There are 10,000 Vethkai soldiers in those jungles. You brought 6 people." He tried to keep his voice steady. Tejo looked toward the jungle. The orange glow of fires flickered between the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a Vethkai war horn sounded, low and hungry. He looked back at Pelin. "Show us where they are coming from," he said. And something in the way he said it, something quiet and final, made Pelin believe, against all logic, against all reason, that 6 might be enough. The humans moved through the outpost like they owned it. Not rudely, not with arrogance. They simply looked at the crumbling walls, the flickering power systems, the frightened soldiers, and immediately began working as though they had been here 100 times before. As though a burning colony under siege was just another Tuesday. The Tessari garrison watched them. They couldn't help it. Nari, the combat engineer, was the first to make them stare. She walked up to a section of the outer wall that had been weakened by Vethkai bombardment. The wall panels were made of alien alloy, each one weighing as much as a small vehicle. Tessari workers used mechanical lifters to move them. Nari grabbed a panel with both hands, pulled it free from the wall, and carried it across the courtyard. She set it down, cut it in half with a plasma torch she held like a writing pen, and began welding the pieces into an angled barricade. A Tessari soldier turned to his friend and said, "She just carried that with her hands." His friend didn't answer. He was watching Hyuk. Hyuk had unpacked a weapon from the dropship's cargo hold. It was a rotary cannon, a multi-barreled gun that the Tessari military database classified as a vehicle-mounted weapon system. It was meant to be bolted to the top of an armored transport. Hyuk set it on the ground, sat cross-legged beside it, and began taking it apart with practiced fingers. He cleaned each piece, checked it, and put it back together in less than 10 minutes. Then he picked the whole thing up, stood, and slung it across his back with a harness he had brought for exactly this purpose. He was going to carry it, on foot, into battle. Pelon watched this from the command room window. He felt something he had never felt before. It was not quite fear, and not quite hope. It was the feeling of seeing something that did not fit into any category his mind had prepared. Inside the medical bay, Yuna introduced herself to the Tessari doctors. She was polite and warm. She smiled easily and asked gentle questions about Tessari biology. How much impact could their exoskeletons absorb? What was their blood pressure range? How did they respond to shock? The chief Tessari medic answered honestly. Their exoskeletons could handle very little impact. A fall from standing height could crack their ribs. A strong blow to the chest could stop their hearts. They were, by any measure, extremely fragile. Yuna nodded slowly. She didn't say anything unkind, but she quietly adjusted the settings on every piece of medical equipment in the bay. She changed the force limits on the automated stretchers. She reprogrammed the pressure settings on the wound sealers. Everything was turned down, softened, made gentle enough for creatures whose bodies could break under a firm handshake. The Tessari doctors watched her do this and realized something that made them go very quiet. The human was not adjusting the equipment because it was malfunctioning. She was adjusting it because the default human settings would have hurt them. Meanwhile, Sora sat down at the colony's communication console. The Tessari intelligence team had spent 3 days trying to crack the Vethkai communication encryption. They had made no progress. The Vethkai used a layered signal protocol that rotated its keys every few hours, and the Tessari simply didn't have the processing power to keep up. Sora plugged a small device into the console, cracked her knuckles, and started typing. 40 minutes later, she leaned back in her chair and said, "I'm in." She pulled up a holographic display of the entire area. Vethkai unit positions, supply routes, command nodes, patrol schedules, everything. The complete enemy battle plan was laid out in glowing light on the table. Pelon stared at the display. His intelligence chief stared at the display. Everyone in the room stared at the display. "How?" the intelligence chief asked. Sora shrugged. "Their encryption is based on a mathematical pattern. Humans figured out this type of pattern about 300 years ago. It is basically a puzzle. I like puzzles." Nobody in the room knew what to say to that. And then there was Dohun, the sniper, the quiet one. Nobody saw Dohun leave. One moment he was in the courtyard checking his rifle, and the next moment he was gone. Just gone. A Tessari guard at the eastern gate swore he never saw anyone pass through. The motion sensors didn't pick up a thing. Dohun had walked out of a fortified military outpost, past 2 guard posts and a sensor grid, and into a jungle filled with 10,000 enemy soldiers, and he had done it without making a sound. Teho didn't seem worried. When Pelon asked where the 6th human had gone, Teho just said, "Scouting," and went back to studying the tactical display. Night came. The twin moons of the gas giant that Aluum 3 orbited rose slowly above the burning tree line. The air smelled like smoke and sap. Somewhere in the darkness, Vethkai war drums began to beat. They came at the eastern wall. 500 Vethkai warriors, running low and fast across the open ground. They were reptilian, thick-skinned, with powerful legs and clawed hands. Each one carried a plasma lance that glowed green in the dark. They moved together like a wave, organized and brutal. The Tessari defenders opened fire from the wall. Pulse bolts rained down on the advancing Vethkai. They burned small marks into the thick reptilian hide. The Vethkai kept running. They barely slowed down. Pelin's stomach turned to ice. He had seen this before. The pulse weapons stung the Vethkai, irritated them, but they were not enough to stop a charge. In every previous engagement, this was the moment when the line broke and the Tessari ran. Then Teho spoke into his communicator. One word. Now. Hyuk stepped up to the wall and opened fire. The rotary cannon screamed. There was no other word for the sound it made. It was a continuous roar of metal and fire that shook the stones under Pelin's feet. The rounds were not light energy. They were physical projectiles, solid metal moving at incredible speed. And when they hit the Vethkai front line, the effect was immediate and devastating. Bodies fell. The ground tore apart. The first 3 rows of the charge simply stopped existing. At the same moment, the ground in front of the eastern wall erupted. Nari had spent her first hour at the colony, planting directional mines in the approach lanes. She hadn't told anyone. Now she triggered them in sequence, and each explosion sent shrapnel and dirt into the Vethkai ranks, breaking their formation into confused clusters. Sora hit a button on her console. Across the jungle, Vethkai communication channels dissolved into noise. Half of the attacking units received orders to advance. The other half received orders to retreat. The wave broke apart, soldiers crashing into each other, officers screaming commands that nobody could hear over the jammed frequencies. And from somewhere in the dark jungle, far behind the Vethkai line, a single shot rang out. Then another. Then another. Each shot found an officer. Each officer fell. Dohun was out there, invisible, patient, and every trigger pull removed another piece of the enemy's leadership. The Vethkai retreated, dragging their wounded, leaving hundreds of dead on the field. The eastern wall stood. The Tessari soldiers stood on it, shaking, covered in dust, staring at the carnage below them. Nobody cheered. The Tessari were too shocked to cheer. They had never seen anything like this. Not the weapons, not the explosions, not the cold and systematic way the 6 humans had turned 500 enemy soldiers into a defeated, running mob. In the silence that followed, Ovali found Teho on the wall. The human captain was reloading his weapon. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He looked like a man who had just finished a long walk, not a man who had just fought off a small army. "Captain," Ovali said. His voice was barely a whisper. "How does a species become like you? How does this happen?" Teho looked at him. The scar on his face caught the moonlight. His dark eyes were calm, but not cold. There was something deep in them. Something old and tired and very much alive. "Everything on our world tried to kill us," Teho said. "The weather, the animals, the diseases, the land itself. Everything. For millions of years, everything on Earth tried to kill us." He paused. "So we got better at not dying." He turned back to the jungle. Somewhere out there, the Vethkai field commander was receiving the battle report. For the first time in the entire campaign, the commander sent a message to the orbiting fleet requesting a delay before the next assault. Something on the ground had changed. The commander did not yet understand what, but he felt it, deep in his cold reptilian brain, in the place where instinct lived. For the first time, the predator felt like prey. The Vethkai were not stupid. That was what made them dangerous. After the failed assault on the eastern wall, the Vethkai field commander pulled his forces back to a safe distance and began studying the problem. He sent small scout drones over the outpost, flying high and quiet, recording everything below. The drones found something strange. Among the hundreds of normal Tessari heat signatures inside the colony, there were 6 that burned far hotter, nearly 10 degrees hotter than any known cooperative species. The 6 signatures moved faster, worked longer, and never seemed to rest. The commander reviewed the footage. He watched one of the hot signatures carry a wall panel that should have required a machine. He watched another assemble a weapon designed for a vehicle. He didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew it wasn't normal. He ordered his officers to study everything the cooperative registry had on the species called humans. The species was new to the galactic community. There was very little data, but what data existed made the commander read the file twice, and then a third time, and then he closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. Inside the outpost, Tejo called a meeting. Helen, Ovali, and the remaining Tessari officers gathered in the command room. The holographic map that Sora had built glowed on the table, showing the positions of every Vethkai unit in the area. There were a lot of red dots, thousands of them, spread through the jungle in organized camps and patrol routes. Tejo studied the map. Then he looked at Pelin. "We need to attack," he said. The room went silent. Pelin thought he had misheard. "Attack, Captain? We are surrounded. We are outnumbered nearly 2,000 to 1. Our walls are barely holding. You want to go out there?" "Yes," Tejo said. He pointed to the map. "Here, their forward supply depot, 3 kilometers east. Here, their ammunition storage, 5 kilometers south. And here, their mobile command center, 7 kilometers northwest. We hit all 3 in the next 72 hours. Pelin shook his head slowly. "This is insane. No offense to your abilities, Captain, but you have 6 soldiers. 6, even after last night. They still have thousands." Tejo nodded. "That's why we need to attack. If we sit here and wait, they'll eventually bring enough force to crush us. But if we hit their supplies, their communications, their command structure, we turn their size into a weakness. A big army that can't eat, can't talk, and can't organize isn't an army. It's a crowd." He looked around the room. "On Earth, we have a concept. We call it disproportionate response. You don't match the enemy. You don't try to be equal. You hit them so hard, so fast, and so unexpectedly that their numbers don't matter. You make them afraid to sleep." Ovali looked at the floor. Neither of them had a better idea. Tejo took Hyuk with him on the first raid. The target was the Vethkai ammunition depot, a fortified camp 3 kilometers into the jungle, with 80 guards. 2 humans against 80 Vethkai warriors. They left at midnight. They moved through the jungle in complete darkness. The Tessari had night vision equipment that could see about 30 meters in the dark. Tejo and Hyuk didn't use any equipment. Human eyes adjusted to the dark naturally. Not perfectly, not like a nocturnal species, but enough. And where their eyes failed, their other senses picked up the slack. They heard the guards breathing. They smelled the chemical fuel a Vethkai used for their weapons. They felt vibrations in the ground from heavy footsteps. They reached the depot in 2 hours. Tejo studied the layout for 15 minutes. Then they moved. Hyuk hit the front gate with the rotary cannon, while Tejo flanked from the east with grenades and a rifle. The Vethkai guards were trained soldiers, but they were trained to fight other cooperative species that were slower, weaker, and more fragile than them. They were not trained for a human carrying a weapon that could cut through their armor like paper, moving at a speed that their eyes couldn't track in the dark. The depot burned. The ammunition inside cooked off in a series of explosions that lit up the jungle for kilometers. The Vethkai lost enough supplies to equip a battalion. On the way back, a Vethkai patrol found them. A plasma bolt caught Tejo in the side, burning through his armor and into his ribs. Hyuk killed the patrol, threw Tejo over his shoulder, and jogged the 2 kilometers back to the outposts, carrying both Tejo and the rotary cannon. When they arrived, Yuna met them at the gate. She looked at the burn wound on Tejo's side and said, That's deep. You'll need to rest. Later, Taeho said through his teeth, brief me on the next target. The second operation was Sora's. She didn't need to leave the outpost. From her console, she injected false intelligence into the Vethkai communication network. She sent orders that looked exactly like real Vethkai command transmissions, because she had been studying their language patterns for 2 days, and could now imitate their officers perfectly. That night, 2 Vethkai battalions fired on each other in the jungle. Each one believed the other was a disguised enemy unit. By the time the real commander sorted out the confusion, 37 Vethkai were dead, and both battalions were too shaken to fight effectively for 2 days. Sora did this while eating a ration bar with her other hand. Dohan's operation was the one that Tessari would have nightmares about. He was gone for 36 hours. His target was a Vethkai forward observation post, a hilltop position with 12 elite soldiers who were directing artillery strikes on the colony. Taking it out would blind the Vethkai's long-range attacks. Dohan came back on the morning of the 3rd day. He walked through the eastern gate, covered in mud and dark stains. His rifle was on his back. In his hand, he carried a short, heavy knife. It was not clean. Ovali was there when he arrived. The Tessari diplomat looked at the knife, then at Dohan's face. The human's expression was blank. Not angry, not proud, just empty, the way a tool is empty when it's done being used. The observation post? Ovali asked. Gone, Dohan said. All 12? Yes. Ovali hesitated. Did you use the rifle? No. The word hung in the air like smoke. Ovali didn't ask anything else. Meanwhile, Nari turned the jungle into a death trap. She went out each night and came back before dawn, planting devices made from salvaged Vethkai technology. Tripwires connected to explosive charges, pressure plates that triggered shrapnel bursts, false trails that led patrols into dead ends, where hidden weapons fired automatically. Within 3 days, the Vethkai stopped sending patrols into certain sectors of the jungle entirely. Soldiers refused to go. The officers couldn't force them. The jungle, which the Vethkai had considered their territory, now belonged to something else. And through all of this, Yuna kept everyone alive. Not just the humans, everyone. On the second night, a Tessari soldier was brought to the medical bay, with injuries that the Tessari doctors called fatal. Massive internal damage, internal bleeding. No Tessari had ever survived such wounds. Yuna looked at the scans, rolled up her sleeves, and operated for 3 hours. She worked with her hands, directly, because the automated surgical tools were too imprecise for what she needed to do. She stitched internal organs with thread thinner than hair, holding instruments with fingers that could have crushed bone, but instead moved with impossible delicacy. The soldier survived. When the Tessari chief medic asked her how she knew so much about their anatomy, Yuna said she had studied it on the flight over. The flight had been 6 hours long. On the 4th night, Pelin found Taeho in the command room. The human captain was alone, studying the tactical display. His side was bandaged where the plasma bolt had hit him. He should have been resting. He wasn't. Do you ever sleep? Pelin asked. When there's time, Taeho said. Are you afraid? Taeho looked at him. For a moment his calm mask slipped, and Pelin saw something underneath. Tiredness, worry, the weight of 6 lives and 12,000 civilians pressing down on a single pair of shoulders. Every time, Taeho said quietly. But fear is useful. It means I'm paying attention. Pelin stared at him. He had assumed the humans were fearless. That was what made them so effective. But no, they were afraid. They felt everything the Tessari felt. They just didn't let it stop them. They carried the fear like they carried their weapons. Like Hyuk carried the rotary cannon. Like Dohan carried the weight of 12 silent kills. They picked it up, and they kept walking. That, Pelin realized, was so much worse than fearlessness, and so much more admirable. Far away, in the Vethkai command ship orbiting Aluum 3, the field commander received his latest strategic assessment. He read it 3 times. 6 hostiles had inflicted more damage than the entire Tessari garrison combined. Supply lines were cut. Communications were compromised. Morale was crumbling. The assessment recommended reclassifying the engagement from colonial suppression to contested warfare. The commander approved the recommendation. Then he called in his elite units. The war was about to get ugly. Day 5 began with the sky falling. The Vethkai had stopped playing careful. Their fleet in orbit turned its guns downward, and beams of white light struck the ground around the outpost like the fists of an angry god. The earth shook so hard that cracks split the floors of the civilian shelters. Children screamed. Dust rained from the ceilings. The lights went out, came back on, and went out again. Elite shock troops in heavy armor led the charge. Behind them came standard infantry in a wave so wide that it stretched from one end of the clearing to the other. Behind the infantry came armored vehicles, low and fast, carrying heavy plasma cannons that could melt through walls. Helen stood in the command room and watched the wave approach on the tactical display. The entire screen was red. He turned to Tejo. "They're coming with everything," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Tejo nodded. He had expected this. He turned on his communicator. "All positions. This is the real one. Hold the line." The first wave hit the northern wall. Hyuk was there. He had been standing at his position for 2 hours already, the rotary cannon mounted and ready. When the Vethkai came into range, he opened fire, and the night split apart with noise and light. Hyuk held the northern wall alone for 9 minutes. 9 minutes against hundreds of charging Vethkai shock troops. He fired until the cannon glowed red. He fired until the ammunition belt ran dry, reloaded, and fired again. His armor was dented from plasma bolts that had struck him and failed to punch through. The wall around him was chewed apart by enemy fire. He stood in the middle of the destruction like a rock in a river, and he did not move. Then a Vethkai plasma lance caught him in the chest. It wasn't a glancing hit. The bolt came from an armored vehicle at close range, and it hit Hyuk square in the center of his torso. The blast blew him backward off his feet. His armor melted inward. His left arm, which had been bracing the cannon, shattered at the elbow. Any Tessari would have died instantly. The impact alone would have stopped a Tessari heart, even without the burn. Hyuk hit the ground, lay still for 3 seconds, and then stood up. He stood up. He grabbed the rotary cannon with his right hand. His left arm hung useless at his side, broken and burned. He braced the weapon against the wall, one-handed, and kept firing. His face behind the cracked visor was tight with pain, but his trigger finger never stopped moving. Yuna found him like that. She ran through enemy fire to reach him, grabbed him by the shoulder, and tried to pull him off the line. Hyuk outweighed her by 40 kilograms and didn't want to go. "You have a shattered arm and second-degree burns across your chest," she shouted over the noise. "You're coming with me." "There are still enemies on the wall," he shouted back. "There will be enemies on the wall for the next 6 hours. Your arm will not reattach itself. Move." He argued with her the entire way. Not angrily, almost politely, as if being pulled out of a battle with a broken arm was a mild inconvenience. On the eastern side, things went worse. Sora was in the communication tower when a Vethkai artillery round hit the base of the structure. The tower groaned, tilted, and came down. Metal and stone collapsed on top of her position. When the dust cleared, Sora was pinned under a beam, her right leg broken below the knee, surrounded by shattered equipment. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. But her datapad, cracked and flickering, had landed within arm's reach. She grabbed it, wiped the dust from the screen with bloody fingers, and kept working. Lying on her back under a collapsed tower with a broken leg, Sora continued jamming Vethkai communications. She rerouted their signals, fed false data into their networks, and scrambled their coordination. When she found the frequency of the Vethkai Mobile Command Center, she locked onto it and traced its location. When Nari dug her out an hour later, cutting through the debris with a plasma torch, Sora's first words were not "thank you" or "help me." Her first words were a set of coordinates. "That's their command center," she said through gritted teeth. 7.2 kilometers northwest. Write it down. Nari wrote it down. Then she carried Sora to the medical bay over one shoulder, while firing her sidearm at a Vethkai flanking squad with the other hand. In the jungle, Dohun was running. He had been caught in the open during a scouting run when a Vethkai hunter squad found his trail. 40 elite soldiers, fresh and rested, against one human who had barely slept in 5 days. They surrounded him in a half-circle and began closing in. Dohun ran, but he didn't run toward the outpost. He ran deeper into the jungle, into the sectors that the Vethkai had learned to avoid, into the killing ground that Nari had spent 4 days building. The Vethkai followed him. They were fast, confident, and angry. They chased him through the trees and the vines and the dark. The first trap took out 6 of them, a tripwire connected to a cluster of salvaged Vethkai grenades. The explosion broke their formation. The survivors pushed forward anyway. The second trap took out 4 more. A pressure plate that triggered a directional blast of metal shrapnel. The jungle floor was rigged with death, and Dohun knew exactly where every piece of it was. He led them through the traps for 2 hours. When he finally emerged from the jungle and stumbled through the outpost gate, he was covered in blood. His own, from cuts and scrapes, and theirs, from the ones the traps had missed and he had dealt with personally. 40 Vethkai had chased him into the jungle. None of them came out. Dohun collapsed just inside the gate. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. Yuna reached him in seconds, checked his pulse, and said, "He'll live. He just needs sleep." She said it as if sleep was medicine, and for a human, perhaps it was. Inside the command room, Taeho faced the hardest decision. The Vethkai were about to breach the eastern wall. The section that Sora's tower had fallen on was weakened, and a concentrated Vethkai assault force was pushing through. Behind that wall were the civilian shelters, 12,000 Tessari men, women, and children. If the wall fell, the Vethkai would be on top of them in minutes. Taeho studied the tactical display. He ran the numbers. Then he called Nari. "Blow the eastern wall," he said. Nari didn't hesitate. She understood. Pelin didn't. "What?" Pelin shouted. "You want to destroy our own wall?" "That's the only thing between them and our civilians," Taeho said. His voice was quiet. "If it falls on their terms, they come through organized, and we can't stop them. If it falls on our terms, it falls inward, into a space we control, and they walk into a kill zone." "There are defenders on that wall," Nari shouted. "I know." Taeho's jaw tightened. "Pull them back. You have 90 seconds. Pelin pulled the defenders back. Nari triggered the charges. The eastern wall came down in a controlled collapse, falling inward and creating a narrow corridor of rubble. The Vethkai, seeing the wall fall, surged forward. Hundreds of them poured through the gap, roaring, weapons raised, expecting to find open ground and helpless civilians. Instead, they found crossfire. Taeho had positioned every available weapon on the buildings overlooking the breach. When the Vethkai were packed into the narrow corridor of rubble, the humans and the remaining Tessari opened fire from 3 sides. It was over in minutes. The corridor filled with smoke and silence, but the explosion had sent shrapnel into the retreating Tessari defenders. 7 soldiers were wounded, 2 badly. Pelin turned on Taeho with fury in his eyes. "You wounded my people." Taeho met his gaze. He didn't look away, he didn't apologize, but his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, held a weight that Pellin hadn't seen before. A heaviness that went deeper than tiredness. 7 wounded, Tejo said, or 12,000 dead. That was the choice. Pellin opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the breach, at the corridor full of fallen enemies, at the wall that was gone now, but had taken the assault with it. He looked back at Tejo, and saw a man carrying a burden so heavy it should have crushed him. She treated everyone. Humans, Tessari, anyone who was hurt. She moved between beds with hands that had not stopped for 12 hours, stitching wounds, setting bones, fighting death with the same stubbornness that her species brought to everything. A young Tessari soldier lay on one of the beds. He had been hit by shrapnel from the wall collapse. His exoskeleton was cracked. His breathing was shallow. His dark eyes, glassy with pain, looked up at Yuna. "Are you gods?" he whispered. "Your kind, are you gods?" Yuna stopped. She looked down at him. She reached out and took his hand, very gently, very carefully, because she knew that her natural grip could crush his delicate fingers like dry sticks. "No," she said softly. "We're just people who got really stubborn about living." She held his hand until his breathing steadied and his eyes closed in sleep. Then she moved to the next bed. By nightfall, the assault had broken. The colony still stood, but everything was damaged. The walls, the people, the hope. Everyone, human and Tessari, was running on nothing. Empty, broken, held together by will alone. Then Sora, propped up in a bed with her broken leg wrapped in a splint, made a sound. A sharp surprise sound that cut through the exhaustion like a knife. Everyone looked at her. She was staring at her cracked datapad with wide eyes. She had patched into the long-range sensor array, a habit she had developed over 5 days, checking for any signals from the wider galaxy. "Captain," she said, her voice cracked, "I'm reading 32 human ships entering the system." The room went still. "Say again," Tejo said. 32 ships. Terran 3rd Expeditionary Response Group. They're here, Captain." Her voice broke into something that was almost a laugh. "They're here." Tejo leaned back against the wall. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 5 days, the iron mass cracked, and beneath it, just for a second, was a tired, hurt, relieved man who had held the world on his shoulders and had just felt someone take part of the weight. He opened his eyes. "Tell them we're still here," he said. "Tell them the line held." A Vethkai blockade fleet had held the Aluum 3 system for 6 days, without challenge. 5 heavy cruisers and a carrier, bristling with weapons, arranged in a perfect orbital net. Nothing had gotten through except one battered human dropship, and that had been a mistake they didn't intend to repeat. When the 32 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the Vethkai fleet commander had exactly 4 minutes to react. He wasted 2 of them staring at his tactical display. The human ships were not what he expected. Cooperative warships were typically elegant, long, smooth, designed to look impressive at diplomatic functions. The human ships looked like they had been built by people who expected to be shot at. They were heavy, angular, covered in thick armor plating and weapon mounts. They had no decorative features, no sleek lines, no diplomatic grace. They were machines built for one purpose, and they did not pretend otherwise. The Terran 3rd Expeditionary Response Group arranged itself into a formation that no cooperative species had ever used. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't cautious. It was a spear pointed directly at the center of the Vethkai blockade. The fleet commander ordered his ships to open fire. The Vethkai cruisers unleashed a concentrated barrage, enough energy to melt through a standard cooperative battleship's shields in seconds. The human ships took the hits. Their shields flickered. They kept coming. Then they fired back. The lead human battleship launched a kinetic round. It was not an energy beam. It was not plasma. It was a solid slug of dense metal, accelerated to a fraction of light speed by electromagnetic rails, that ran the entire length of the ship. The cooperative classified weapons of this type as planetary siege armament, reserved for bombarding fortified moons and asteroids. The humans classified it as standard naval armament. The round hit the HFY flagship amidships. The ship broke in half. Both halves continued forward on momentum for a few seconds, trailing fire and debris, and then the reactor containment failed, and the flagship became a small, brief sun. The rest of the battle lasted 14 minutes. 14 minutes. The HFY blockade, which had comfortably held the system against all projected cooperative responses, was reduced to scrap metal and drifting wreckage in less time than it took to eat a meal. The human ships moved through the debris field without slowing down, their weapons still hot, already scanning for the next target. There was no next target. The HFY fleet was gone. On the ground, the reaction was immediate. Human dropships fell from the sky, like seeds from a dying tree. Not one, not 6, dozens. They hit the landing zones around the colony in rapid succession, cargo ramps slamming open, and fresh human marines poured out in organized columns. The Tessari watched from the walls. 6 humans had held the colony for 5 days. Now 600 were forming up in the courtyard below, checking weapons, receiving orders, moving out toward the jungle with the same calm efficiency that Tejo's squad had shown from the beginning. Pelin stood on the wall and watched a human marine jog past, carrying a pack that weighed more than Pelin did. The marine noticed the Tessari commander watching him and nodded politely, the way someone might nod to a neighbor while going for a morning run. In the jungle, the HFY ground forces learned what it meant to face a Deathworld species in full force. The raiding, the traps, the psychological warfare that 6 humans had waged for 5 days had already broken the HFY's confidence. Now those broken, frightened soldiers looked up and saw hundreds of the same species coming toward them through the trees. Units that had fought bravely for days dropped their weapons and ran. Officers who had laughed at the idea of retreat suddenly couldn't give the order fast enough. The human marines advanced steadily, clearing sector after sector, and the HFY line crumbled like wet paper. The HFY field commander stood in his mobile command center and watched the collapse happen in real time. His tactical display, which had once been filled with the confident green markers of his forces, was now almost entirely red. Red for contested, red for lost, red for destroyed. A young HFY officer beside him whispered, "What are they?" The commander stared at the display. His clawed hands gripped the edge of the table. In his entire career, across dozens of conquered worlds, his species had never surrendered. The HFY did not surrender. It was not in their culture. It was not in their blood. He looked at the display for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "We asked them to send soldiers. They sent their kind." He transmitted the surrender signal. It was the first time in HFY recorded history that such a signal had been sent. The officers in the command center stared at their leader with wide, unbelieving eyes. But none of them argued. None of them had the will left to argue. The guns went silent. The jungle, which had burned and screamed for 6 days, slowly went quiet. Tejo heard the news standing in the outpost courtyard. A human communications officer from the fleet relayed the message. HFY forces had surrendered. All of them. The ground campaign was over. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He sat down on an ammunition crate, put his head in his hands, and breathed for a long time. Just breathed. Beside him, Nari sat on the ground with her back against a wall, eyes closed, already sketching improved barricade designs in her head. Sora was still in the medical bay, her broken leg elevated, gritting at her datapad like she had won a game. Dohun was asleep. He had been asleep for 19 hours, and no one had dared wake him. Hyuk was in surgery. The human doctors from the fleet had taken one look at his arm and his burns and had rushed him to the medical ship. Yuna had refused treatment for her own injuries until she checked on every single Tesserae patient in the medical bay. The human doctors had to order her to stop working. 2 days later, Pelin boarded the human medical ship. The ship was enormous by Tesserae standards, but the corridors were built to human scale, which meant they were short and wide. The gravity was set to Earth standard, 1 full point, and Pelin felt the weight press down on his legs with every step. He understood now, in a physical way, what it meant to live on a death world. Every step was heavier. Every movement cost more energy. And humans didn't just endure this weight, they grew strong under it. They ran in it, they fought in it, they danced in it. He found Tejo in a recovery room. The human captain was sitting up in bed, reading something on a datapad. His side was properly bandaged now, his burns treated by doctors with real equipment instead of field kits. He looked better, still tired, still carrying something heavy behind his eyes, but better. Pelin stood at the door for a moment, then entered. "Captain, I came to thank you, officially, on behalf of the colony and the Tesserae people." Tejo set down the datapad. "You don't need to thank us. You sent a signal. That's the deal." Pelin sat down in a chair that was slightly too short for him. "I need to understand something. Your species is not the strongest in the cooperative, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced. There are species with tougher bodies, sharper senses, and bigger ships. How did 6 of you hold a line that my entire garrison could not?" Tejo was quiet for a while. He looked out the window. Beyond the glass, the stars moved slowly as the ship orbited. Somewhere below, Aluum 3 was healing. The fires were out. The civilians were safe. "On Earth," Tejo said, "there's an old saying. Fall down 7 times, stand up 8. He paused. "We're not special because we don't break. We break all the time. Bones, spirits, everything. We break constantly. But we get back up. Every time we get back up. That's the thing about coming from a world that's always trying to kill you. You don't learn to be invincible. You learn to be stubborn." Pelin looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. In the weeks that followed, the Battle of Aluum 3, as it came to be called, sent ripples across the Galactic Cooperative. Every member species received the same report. A colony defended by 6 humans against 10,000 Vethkai. Supply lines destroyed by midnight raids. Armies turned against each other by a single hacker with a datapad. An elite observation post eliminated by 1 soldier with a knife. A wall brought down on purpose to create a kill zone. A medic who learned alien anatomy in 6 hours and performed surgeries that alien doctors called impossible. Species that had barely noticed humanity's entry into the cooperative now pulled up Earth's file and read it with new eyes. They read about the ice ages, when sheets of frozen water covered the planet, and the humans survived by wrapping themselves in animal skins and building fires. They read about the predators, the wolves and the big cats and the bears, and how the humans hadn't just survived them, but had tamed some of them and driven others to the edge of extinction. They read about the diseases, plagues that killed millions and were eventually defeated not by evolution, but by human science. They read about the wars, the terrible, endless wars that humans fought against each other, because apparently a death world wasn't dangerous enough, and the humans decided to be dangerous to themselves as well. And at the bottom of the file, they read the line that made them sick very still. Despite Class 12 death world conditions, the species not only survived, but became the apex predator of their entire planet before achieving spaceflight. A quiet understanding spread across the galaxy. Humanity was not a minor species. Humanity was not a curiosity. Humanity was the answer to a question that no one had thought to ask. What happens when a death world doesn't destroy the life on it? What happens when the life fights back? What happens when a world does everything it can to kill a species, and the species refuses to die? You get humans. 3 months after the battle, the Galactic Cooperative held a special council session. Diplomats from 100 species filled the great chamber. Ovali was there, standing at the podium. He was still thin, still fragile, still the same trembling liaison officer who had sent a desperate signal from a burning colony. But something in his eyes had changed. He told them the story. He told them about the dropship that punched through a blockade on fire, about the captain who walked out and said, "Show us where they are coming from," about the engineer who carried wall panels with her bare hands, and the sniper who moved like a ghost, and the medic who held a dying soldier's hand gently enough not to break it. The chamber was silent. Ovali took a breath. He looked out at the assembled faces of 100 species, and he said, "We asked for backup. What we got were Deathworlders. I recommend, with the greatest possible urgency, that we never give them a reason to be anything other than our friends." The Council voted unanimously to upgrade humanity's cooperative status from provisional member to full strategic partner. The motion passed in less time than it had taken the human fleet to destroy the Vethkai blockade. Somewhere on a medical ship orbiting a healing moon, Tejo read the news on his datapad. He smiled. Just slightly, for the first time in a long while. Then he put the datapad down and went back to sleep. He had earned it.